I still remember standing in the lawyer's office while my daughter-in-law smirked and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "She only got that dirty workshop. We got the $800,000 house." My son nodded instead of standing up for me, and the lawyer gave me a sympathetic look that felt like pity. Brianna added, "Your husband left you nothing but junk," and the whole room went awkwardly quiet. I stayed calm, but inside, I felt a deep ache. Months later, everything changed. They lost the house, their savings, and the lifestyle they bragged about nonstop. Then one evening, Brianna came to my door crying and begged me to sell something from the workshop to save them. What I found inside my husband's old toolbox was not junk. It was the key to a discovery that sent Tesla's legal team straight to my home. Before I tell you what they offered, let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Helen Ward, and for most of my life I lived a simple and steady routine in Cedar Harbor, Washington. My husband George was an engineer who loved building things, fixing things, and dreaming up ideas he never bragged about. His workshop sat behind our house, filled with old tools, half-finished projects, stacks of notebooks, and dusty metal drawers that only he understood. When he passed away, part of me felt like that workshop still belonged to him, so I rarely stepped inside. I preferred to remember the sound of his radio playing in the background and the way he hummed when he worked. When his will was read, the lawyer explained that George left our son Mark and his wife Brianna the lake house valued at $800,000. He left me the workshop. Brianna gasped dramatically and whispered, "He left you trash," as if she was doing me a favor by stating it. Mark laughed nervously and did nothing to stop her. The lawyer gave me a gentle look, expecting me to feel hurt, and I was hurt, but not because of the workshop. I was hurt because my own son let his wife speak to me that way. After the reading, life went back to quiet days and peaceful routines. My brother Victor checked on me every week. My neighbor Mrs. Langley brought dinners when she cooked too much. People in town knew I was grieving and treated me with kindness. Meanwhile, Mark and Brianna posted pictures of themselves at the lake house, drinking wine on the deck and bragging about their new chapter. I kept to myself and tried not to take their behavior personally. I believed that as long as I stayed grounded, everything would eventually find its place. I never imagined that the workshop would become the center of a storm. I never imagined that Brianna, who mocked every piece of it, would one day stand on my porch begging for help. And I certainly never imagined that something my husband hid in a simple metal toolbox would hold the power to change all our lives forever. If you're enjoying the story so far, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In the months after the will reading, I watched Mark and Brianna's perfect little world fall apart piece by piece, though I never wished for it to happen. Their lake house, the one Brianna boasted about online every week, turned into a financial trap they could not escape. Brianna's online boutique, which she once described as her future empire, collapsed after months of poor sales, late shipments, and angry customers demanding refunds she could not afford. Mark lost his job after his company downsized, and bills began stacking up faster than they could open them. The cracks in their marriage became obvious, and soon even neighbors whispered about the shouting matches coming from their home. During all this, I stayed quiet, partly out of respect, and partly because I did not know how to help people who had spent so much time belittling me. I still loved my son deeply, but Brianna's cruelty had always been sharp enough to push me away. One rainy afternoon, everything changed when I heard frantic knocking at my front door. I opened it and found Brianna standing there, soaked. Mascara streaked across her cheeks, shaking like she had sprinted the entire way. Mark stood behind her, looking exhausted and ashamed. She took a breath and said, "Mom, please, we need help. We are losing everything." Her voice cracked as she continued, "Sell something from that workshop. Anything, please." Her desperation was so strong that for a moment, she did not even sound like the same woman who once mocked me in front of a lawyer. Mark's voice was quiet as he said, "We are out of options." I looked at both of them and felt a mix of sadness, frustration, and a strange sense of clarity. For years, they treated that workshop like trash. Now, they saw it as a lifeline. I told them I would look, not because they demanded it, but because I needed to understand the one thing George left me. After they left, I walked toward the workshop with slow steps. I had avoided going inside for months because the room was still thick with memories of George. His handwritten notes were scattered across shelves, wires and parts were tucked into drawers, and the smell of sawdust still lingered from years of late-night work. I stood inside the doorway, staring at everything he had built, feeling both comfort. The place looked like a mess to anyone who did not know him, but I knew every corner held purpose. I began searching through drawers and cabinets, wiping dust from old notebooks filled with diagrams and equations I could not understand. The deeper I looked, the more I realized how much George had been working on things he never shared with anyone. He had always been quiet about his inventions, telling me he would only reveal them when the time was right. I moved toward his large metal toolbox, the one he always kept locked. For years, he told me it held his most important tools, but I never knew what that meant. The lock had weakened over time, and with a gentle pull, the lid lifted open. Inside were neatly arranged tools, sealed envelopes, and a small silver USB drive labeled in his handwriting, "Patent. Do not lose." My heart jumped. I sat on the stool beside the workbench, holding the USB in both hands, staring at the label over and over. I whispered to myself, "What were you working on, George?" The room felt suddenly heavier, as if the whole workshop had been waiting for someone to find this. I knew instantly that this was not something I could ignore. I closed the toolbox carefully, slipped the USB into my pocket, locked the workshop behind me, and walked back into the house. I did not call Mark or Brianna. I did not tell anyone except my brother Victor. He listened quietly and said, "Helen, this could be important, very important. You need a patent attorney as soon as possible." That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the USB, realizing the conflict was no longer about insults or embarrassment. Something much bigger was hidden in that workshop, and whatever it was, my husband had trusted me to find it. That trust meant more to me than anything Brianna or Mark had ever said, and I knew the next step could change everything about my life and theirs. The next morning, with the USB tucked securely inside a small pouch in my purse, I drove to Seattle with my brother Victor sitting beside me, trying to calm my nerves as we approached the office of attorney Sheldon Drake, a well-known patent lawyer recommended by one of Victor's colleagues. The building was modern and quiet, with glass doors and polished floors that made me feel small and out of place, but the receptionist greeted me warmly and led us to a private office. Sheldon stood as we entered, offering a polite handshake and a calm smile that eased my anxiety. I explained how George was an engineer who worked on private projects, how he left me a workshop, and how I discovered the USB labeled with the word patent. Sheldon listened carefully, nodding slowly, then asked permission to open the files in front of me. I handed him the USB with steady hands, though my heart pounded as he inserted it into his computer. The moment the first file opened, his posture changed. His eyes narrowed with concentration, and his fingers hovered over the mouse as he scrolled through pages of detailed engineering designs, formulas, prototypes, and diagrams. I spoke softly. "Is it something serious?" He did not look away from the screen when he answered. "Mrs. Ward, this is more than serious. This is groundbreaking." My breath caught as he continued reading. His voice lowered as if speaking too loudly might break the moment. He explained that George had created a new form of battery temperature regulation system, something companies had been trying to perfect for years. This system could keep electric vehicle batteries stable, prevent overheating, and extend battery life dramatically. Sheldon said, "If this is legitimate and independently created, your husband made a major technological breakthrough." I felt my throat tighten. For years, George had worked late at night, wiping his hands on rags and smiling whenever I asked what he was building. He always said, "Just a little project." Now I understood he had been protecting something significant, something he believed would change the world someday. Sheldon continued to scroll, his voice accelerating with excitement. "These are detailed schematics. He documented every step, the dates, the designs, the progression. This is enough to prove original authorship. He leaned back, rubbing his forehead. This could be worth a tremendous amount of money. I stared at the files on his screen, speechless. Sheldon then looked directly at me and said, "Mrs. Ward, I strongly advise you not to tell anyone about this until I contact the United States Patent Office. Let me handle the verification process." I agreed immediately. Victor squeezed my hand and whispered, "Helen, this is huge." As we left the office, my legs felt shaky, and I had to lean against the hallway wall to steady myself. Victor supported me gently, saying, "George trusted you for a reason. He knew you would do the right thing." I nodded, overwhelmed with emotion. On the drive home, my mind raced with memories of George working in that workshop, humming to himself as he tightened bolts or scribbled diagrams. He never bragged, never talked about changing industries, never demanded recognition. He simply created. That afternoon, as I brewed tea in my kitchen, my phone buzzed. Sheldon's voice was urgent. "Mrs. Ward, Tesla's legal team has been notified through the patent system. They are requesting an immediate in-person meeting about your husband's work." Before I could respond, I heard the sound of several engines outside. I looked through the window to see black SUVs pulling into my driveway. Men and women in tailored suits stepped out, holding folders and briefcases. A woman approached my porch and said, "Mrs. Ward, we represent Tesla. We need to speak with you about your husband's patent." My world shifted all over again. I realized that the turning point was not the USB itself, but the moment I chose to take it to a professional instead of ignoring it. George trusted me to protect his work, and now powerful companies were standing on my doorstep. I understood then that life had taken a turn I could never have predicted, and everything that came next would rest on the decisions I made from that moment forward. The next morning felt unreal as I drove back to Attorney Sheldon Drake's office, carrying the USB drive that had slept untouched in my husband's toolbox for years. Sheldon had asked me to return so he could go over the verification from the patent registry and the responses he received overnight. When I stepped into his office, he looked completely alert, as if he had not slept at all. Papers were spread across his desk, his laptop screen filled with documents stamped with official seals. He motioned for me to sit and said, "Mrs. Ward, I need you to prepare yourself." My stomach tightened as he clicked through the files. He explained that the engineering designs George created were not just impressive, they were years ahead of current industry technology. They described a battery stabilization method that could dramatically reduce overheating in electric vehicles, extend battery life, and lower manufacturing costs. His voice held steady respect when he said, "Your husband was a genius in a way most people never recognized." Hearing that made my eyes sting. I had always known George was brilliant, but he never talked about his work in a way that suggested it could change a global industry. He was humble to the point of hiding his own accomplishments. Sheldon continued, telling me he had contacted the appropriate verification agencies and that overnight, 2 major corporations had tried to request meetings. Then he said the words that left me breathless. Tesla reached out first. Before I could even respond, a knock sounded on Sheldon's office door. His assistant stepped in and said, "They are here." I turned as 3 people in professional suits entered, each wearing a badge with the Tesla logo. One of the representatives introduced herself with a firm handshake and a calm voice. She said, "Mrs. Ward, thank you for meeting with us on such short notice." I felt small sitting in that office with high-level legal professionals who seemed completely aware of the weight of what I carried in my purse. They opened a folder containing printed documents and placed it on the table between us. The lead representative gently slid it toward me and said, "Your husband's patent aligns with technology we have been working to refine for nearly a decade." She explained that battery stabilization was one of their most urgent research challenges. Countless engineers had tried to solve it, and many promising attempts had failed. She paused for a moment, almost as if she wanted me to absorb the seriousness of what she was saying. "Your husband's design provides the missing piece we have been searching for," she continued. "It has the potential to reshape the entire electric vehicle industry. My hands felt warm as I touched the folder, unsure if I was even ready to open it. The Tesla representative added that they had already verified the authenticity of George's files and confirmed that his timestamps placed him as the original creator. There was no competing patent, no legal conflict, no prior claim. Everything belonged entirely to me. Everything belonged entirely to George's legacy. I slowly opened the folder. Inside was a formal offer. The number printed on the page made my breath catch in my throat. I blinked several times, thinking I had read it incorrectly, but the number did not change. The offer was enough to secure not only my future, but the future of my family for generations. It was more than the lake house Mark and Brianna lost. More than anything George or I had ever dreamed of owning. It was life-changing in every direction imaginable. I stared at the paper in shock. The Tesla representative spoke softly, as if she knew this moment would stay with me forever. She said, "This invention has enormous value. We want to honor your husband's work the right way." Sheldon looked at me with pride, reassuring me that the offer was not inflated or unrealistic. It was fair, it was genuine, and it reflected the true magnitude of what George had created. My throat tightened with emotion. For months, Brianna had mocked me for having nothing but an old workshop. She bragged about her expensive house while rolling her eyes at the small life I lived. Yet here I was, sitting in a lawyer's office with Tesla's legal team, waiting for me to acknowledge the worth of something my husband quietly built with his own hands. I thought of George sitting at his workbench late at night, tapping his pencil and muttering ideas to himself. He never bragged. He never chased praise. He never hinted at the scale of what he was creating, but he labeled that USB drive carefully. He wrote, "Do not lose," because he knew someday someone would understand. That day had finally arrived. Tears slipped down my face as I closed the folder. The weight of grief, pride, and justice washed over me all at once. The Tesla team waited patiently while I gathered myself. When I finally looked up, I said, "My husband always believed in doing things the right way. I want to make sure his work is respected." The representative nodded and said, "We will make sure of that." In that moment, I realized that everything Brianna tried to belittle had turned out to be more valuable than anything she ever flaunted. The dirty workshop they laughed at held a future none of them could have imagined, and the legacy they dismissed was now the key to changing an entire industry. When Tesla's offer finally became official and the paperwork was complete, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me, the kind that takes years of struggle to earn. The final contract secured financial stability far beyond anything I ever imagined. But the money was not what moved me the most. It was the realization that George trusted me with something precious long before anyone else even noticed it existed. For months, I had listened to Brianna mock the workshop as if it were a pile of trash. I had watched Mark nod along, too eager to keep the peace with his wife to defend his own mother. Now, as I walked across the workshop floor, with sunlight shining through the dusty windows, I felt proud of myself for holding on to what others dismissed. I traced my hand along the old workbench George built by hand, remembering how he would sit there late at night, humming gently as he sketched new ideas or tightened screws on whatever he was building. He once told me that great things often grow in quiet places because no one thinks to look for them there. For so long, I thought he just meant patience. Now I understood he also meant value. Real value does not need attention to exist. It waits, it endures, and it reveals itself when the time is right. In the weeks after the deal, things changed quickly. Tesla sent a team to secure, catalog, and transport George's designs, tools, and prototypes for preservation and evaluation. They asked for a space to set up a temporary lab in my workshop so they could verify older documents and generate digital archives. Watching professionals in lab coats and suits treat George's belongings with such care brought tears to my eyes more than once. They handled every notebook as if it were a rare artifact, every sketch as if it were a blueprint for the future. The humility in their approach reminded me that genius is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is hidden behind a quiet man, tinkering in a shed while the world walks past him without noticing. Meanwhile, word spread through town that something incredible had happened at my home. Neighbors who once believed Brianna's comments about the workshop being worthless now approached me with new respect. Some apologized for making assumptions. Others simply offered warm smiles and congratulations. My brother Victor took me out for dinner to celebrate, ordering the most expensive meal on the menu and insisting he would pay, even though he knew I could buy the entire restaurant now. We laughed together for the first time in a long while, and I felt grateful for the people who stood by me, even when the world thought I had nothing. As for Mark and Brianna, their attitudes shifted in ways I never expected. One afternoon, Mark showed up alone, carrying a box of old photos from his childhood. He sat on my porch and admitted he had followed Brianna's lead for far too long. He said he regretted letting her talk down to me and wished he had stepped in at the lawyer's office instead of trying to fit into the lifestyle she wanted. I listened quietly, letting him speak without judgment. It hurt to hear how deeply he had lost himself, but it also comforted me to hear sincerity in his voice that I had not heard in years. Brianna came by a few days later, not with demands, but with an uneasy apology. She said she had been wrong about everything, and that losing the lake house opened her eyes to how fragile pride can be. I accepted her apology politely, but kept my boundaries firm. Forgiveness is possible, but trust takes work, and I finally understood that protecting my peace mattered as much as helping my family. With the money from the patent deal, I made decisions that honored both my needs and George's legacy. I renovated my home, fixing things I had put off for years. I created a scholarship fund at the local high school for students pursuing engineering, naming it after George. I donated to a community workshop that helps young inventors build their first projects, and I kept the workshop itself as a private space where I could sit and remember the man who believed in possibilities long before anyone else saw them. I refused to let greed or pride guide any of my choices. Instead, I focused on creating a life that felt grounded, peaceful, and meaningful, just the way George would have wanted. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky glowed with soft color, I stood in the doorway of the workshop and thought about the journey that brought me here. From humiliation in a lawyer's office to the day Tesla parked their black SUVs in my driveway, everything had shifted in ways I never could have predicted. But through it all, one truth stayed clear. What looks small to others may hold a world of value when you truly understand it. George left me more than a workshop. He left me proof that patience, loyalty, and quiet strength can outshine arrogance and greed in the end. And he left me the power to write the rest of my life on my own terms, without fear or apology. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from.